You, Charles, and I did a show at Studio One 3 years ago. More than that. 5 years ago. Before you were even supposed to do it. My name is Alvin Ailey. I'm a choreographer. I build movement, and in movement I go looking for the truth. Being born black in a country wired with prejudice is already a daily fight. Living openly as black and gay under those same stares turns that fight into something brutal. In a world where skin color and sexuality are both used as reasons to exclude the path to real freedom for black gay celebrities, feels less like a red carpet and more like a trap. The second their private life is dragged into the light is often the same moment everything starts to vanish: careers, reputations, families, friends, even the chance to reach the heights they were clearly meant for. Tonight we open a file cabinet that should never have been closed. Inside are 21 names. 21 black artists who made history and were destroyed simply for being honest about who they were. These weren't fringe figures. They were beloved, cheered, copied, studied. And yet they were slowly pushed to the edge by the very systems and communities that once claimed to love them, punished for a part of their identity. They never had the power to change. The 21 stories you're about to hear are proof of how vicious prejudice can be and how much black celebrities can lose when the truth about their sexuality becomes a weapon. We start at case file number 21. 21. Glenn Burke, the baseball legend, erased for telling the truth. On paper, Glenn Burke should have retired a hero. A hard-hitting outfielder for the Los Angeles Dodgers known for sharp swings, fearless base running, and a locker room energy that lit up every dugout he walked into. To his teammates, he was a rising star. To Major League Baseball, he was supposed to be the future. Then the truth about his sexuality stopped being a quiet rumor and became a fact he refused to hide. In 1980, Glenn Burke did something almost unthinkable for a black athlete at that time. He talked openly about being gay in Inside Sports magazine. He believed honesty would set him free. Instead, it made him a target. In a clubhouse culture built on macho bravado, his courage was treated like betrayal. Some Dodgers players started keeping their distance. Others pushed for him to be pushed out entirely. The jokes weren't harmless. The stares weren't subtle. The isolation grew loud. Burke looked for a fresh start with the Oakland Athletics. What he found was worse. Manager Billy Martin didn't just ignore his talent. He reportedly mocked him in front of teammates, spitting out slurs instead of feedback. The message was clear. Glenn Burke wasn't just unwanted, he was unwelcome. Offers dried up. Then they stopped altogether. Without an official ban on paper, Burke was effectively blacklisted. No team would sign him. The league that once wanted his bat now wanted him gone. His income disappeared. The stadium lights went off. San Francisco became his hiding place. Not the glamorous city tourists knew, just a series of cheap rooms, odd jobs, and days blurred by depression. To cope, Glenn turned to drugs. It wasn't about partying anymore, it was about numbing. Every hit was a way to quiet the memory of the man he used to be. In 1994, doctors gave him another blow, an HIV diagnosis. The stigma around AIDS, especially tied to gay men, turned what little support he had into almost nothing. Some family members stepped away. Medical care was thin. Bills piled up. His body weakened and his world shrank to the size of a few square feet. When Glenn Burke died in 1995, Major League Baseball didn't stop. Games were played. Stats were logged. History moved on. The sport rarely spoke his name. Most people had no idea that the casual high five they threw up in every ballpark was a gesture Glenn helped make famous. The league didn't take his life, but it took away the stage where that life once meant something. 20. Bayard Rustin, the architect of a movement discarded for being gay. File 20 doesn't belong to a singer or an actor. It belongs to a strategist, the man behind one of the most important days in American civil rights history. Bayard Rustin was the mind that mapped the 1963 March on Washington. He chose the routes, coordinated the buses, trained the volunteers, and kept the entire operation from collapsing under its own weight. Without Bayard, the image of hundreds of thousands gathered peacefully in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the stage where Dr. King delivered, "I have a dream," might never have existed. But even heroes can be erased when their truth collides with fear. In 1953, Bayard Rustin was arrested in Pasadena after being caught in a parked car with another man. It was a personal moment turned into public ammunition. The FBI pounced. They didn't just file the arrest, they weaponized it. His sexuality became a tool to undercut not only him, but the entire civil rights movement. Whisper campaigns followed him from city to city. Yet what cut deepest didn't come from the government. It came from inside. Some conservative leaders in black churches and organizations saw Bayard's life as a liability. They pressured Dr. King to distance himself from Rustin. The strategist who had taught nonviolent tactics, who had stood by King during some of his most dangerous campaigns, was quietly pushed out of the inner circle. On top of it all, Rustin was forced to register as a sex offender, a label that chained itself to every job application and neighborhood he entered. The man who helped organize freedom now found doors locked with his own name on the Do Not Enter list. Work dried up. Invites stopped coming. He was no longer the architect, just a cautionary detail people avoided mentioning. He lived the last stretch of his life in relative obscurity, his mental health worn down by the knowledge that his brilliance had been buried under shame he never deserved. Only after Bayard Rustin died in 1987 did the public start to say his name with respect again, too late to offer him the recognition he should have had while he was still alive. 19. Max Robinson, the face of the news abandoned in silence. Max Robinson broke a barrier every time he sat behind the anchor desk. He was the first black co-anchor of a national evening newscast on a major network, BC's World News Tonight. Sharp, steady, and charismatic, he proved that a black man could deliver America's most important stories at prime time. He represented possibility for an entire community watching him from their living rooms. Then came the diagnosis. AIV. In the late 1980, those three letters carried more than medical meaning. They carried stigma, fear, and a ready-made narrative about how someone must have lived. Tabloids pounced. They didn't just report that Max was sick, they framed his illness as punishment, twisting his sexuality into a moral headline. Suddenly, America's trusted anchor became a talking point. Behind closed doors, BC executives worried about ratings, advertisers, and backlash from conservative viewers. On paper, it was business. In reality, it was exile. Max Robinson's contract was quietly ended. The man who had once been the network's proud symbol of inclusion was now seen as a risk they didn't want to manage. Losing the job meant losing income, influence, and the daily routine that had anchored his life. As the calls stopped, something else happened too. His support system collapsed. Family members who had once stood beside him began to pull away, fearful of the stigma surrounding AIDS and the gossip attached to his sexuality. Max Robinson, the face once broadcast to millions, was now living in a small apartment in Washington, D.C., counting pills instead of scripts. Medical bills stacked up. Care was limited. In 1988, he died in a public hospital. No studio tribute could erase what had happened. A pioneer had been allowed to fade away in near-total isolation. The newscaster who once told the nation's stories left this world with his own story largely untold. 18. Willie Smith, the fashion visionary erased by fear. In the 1980s, if you saw bold, relaxed street-inspired clothes, walking down a runway with a swagger that felt like real-life, chances are you were looking at Willie Smith's work. His label Williewear was a revolution. It took the energy of black urban style and turned it into high fashion, comfortable, clever, and unapologetically fresh. For a moment it looked like he was rewriting who fashion was for. Then his medical chart became a headline. In 1986, Willie Smith was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. News of his hospitalization leaked, and the whispers started not just about his health, but about his sexuality. In an industry that liked to pretend it was progressive but still listened closely to conservative buyers and scared investors, Willie's truth became dangerous. Articles didn't just mention AIDS, they tied it to scandal, turning his private life into an easy target. Investors began to vanish. Retail partners hesitated. Brands that once fought to collaborate with Willieware suddenly acted like returning a call was too risky. Within months, the everyday machine that kept his company running, capital orders, contracts, collapsed. Willieware filed for bankruptcy. The man who had dressed thousands was left scrambling to cover his basics. Friends helped where they could, but the high-gloss fashion world that had once celebrated his name moved on without looking back. Without strong insurance, Willie Smith's battle with illness played out in public hospitals, not private clinics. He died in 1987, far from the runways he had once dominated. For years, fashion treated his contributions like a footnote, his legacy buried under the stigma that followed both his diagnosis and his love life. 17. Sylvester, the disco star who danced into the dark alone. Case File 17 belongs to a voice that could fill a club in seconds. Sylvester James, known simply as Sylvester, turned dance floors into sanctuaries with songs like You Make Me Feel Mighty Real. His falsetto soared, his sequins blazed, and his presence told queer black kids everywhere you can be exactly who you are. He didn't hide his sexuality. He didn't tone down his drag. He turned both into art. For a while, the world danced with him. But when word spread in 1987 that Sylvester was living with HIV/AIDS, the music stopped in all the places that had once paid him. Radio programmers, especially in conservative markets, quietly dropped his records. Some called him sinful. Some simply labeled him bad for business. Fantasy Records, the label that had pressed his hits, distanced itself. Big venues closed their doors. From international tours, Sylvester was pushed back into small clubs in San Francisco, rooms filled with people who still loved him but couldn't change the reality of shrinking paychecks and growing medical bills. To keep up with treatment, he sold his home. Family members, uncomfortable with his sexuality and terrified of AIDS, stepped away. The distance hurt more than the numbers on his lab results. In 1988, Sylvester died in a public hospital, surrounded not by industry executives, but by a small circle of devoted fans and friends. The sound of his legacy didn't disappear, but for a long time the system that had once profited from his voice refused to claim him. 16. Howard Rollins, the TV hero the industry abandoned. Howard Rollins should have been a long-running lead. With roles in Ragtime and as Detective Virgil Tibbs in the Heat of the Night, he embodied a strong, intelligent black man on screen, exactly the kind of image Hollywood claimed it wanted. But rumors in Hollywood spread faster than syndication. By the late 1980s, whispers started swirling about his private life. An arrest tied to allegedly indecent behavior at a gay bar broke the surface and the press pounced. Suddenly, interviews weren't about his performances. They were about his sexuality. Then, in 1996, another truth surfaced: Howard Rollins was living with HIV/AIDS. Producers and networks, already nervous, acted as if the diagnosis confirmed their worst fears. Contracts vanished. His role on In the Heat of the Night, which had earned him award recognition, was cut loose. The same industry that once framed him as a symbol of strength now treated him like a liability. Faced with relentless scrutiny and no work, Rollins turned to alcohol and drugs. Not as headlines, but as survival tools. Without steady acting income, he mortgaged his home and sold belongings just to keep going. Eventually, he was living off limited assistance, far from the red carpets and studio lots he had once known. In 1996, Howard Rollins died in a public hospital. No grand memorial. No industry-wide tribute. Just another file closed on a man whose only crime was existing outside the narrow box Hollywood built for black leading men. 15. Marlon Riggs, the filmmaker, punished for telling the truth out loud. Marlon Riggs didn't just tell stories, he opened wounds. With his 1,989 documentary Tongues Untied, he put the lives of black gay men on screen without apology. The film was raw, poetic, and honest, in a way that shook viewers who had never seen themselves reflected that clearly. For many it was liberation. For others it was an offense. Conservative critics, including some inside the black community, branded the film obscene, a betrayal of traditional values. Funders took note. PBS, which had helped support his work, backed away. Other potential backers quietly labeled his projects too controversial. His subject matter, his sexuality, his insistence on naming what others wanted to erase it, all became a reason to deny him resources. Then came the diagnosis HIV/AIDS in 1993. The disease attacked his body. The backlash attacked his career. At the very moment when his voice was most needed, doors that should have opened instead slammed shut. Big projects evaporated. Teaching and small grants kept him afloat, but barely. He lived modestly in Oakland, depending at times on help from friends to pay for treatment. What cut deepest wasn't the illness itself. It was where the silence came from. Marlon had expected pushback from conservative politicians. He hadn't expected so much distance from inside the very black community, whose stories he was trying to honor. In 1994, Marlon Riggs died in his apartment, surrounded by unfinished work and a world that was only beginning to understand what he had tried to say. His films would later be studied, praised, and restored. But the man who made them didn't live to see his own vindication. These first 7 files, Burke, Rustin, Robinson, Smith, Sylvester, Rollins, Riggs, have one pattern running through them. The fall never started with a lack of talent. It started the moment the world decided that being black and gay made them expendable. Willie Ninja, the king of voguing who died in the shadows. In the underground ballrooms of New York, before the mainstream ever tried to imitate their moves, there was one name people spoke like a spell: Willie Ninja. He wasn't just a dancer. He was an architect of movement, the man whose sharp, precise catwalk slicing style defined voguing itself. Through Paris, his Burning the World finally got a glimpse of him, tall, poised, angular lines, cutting through the air with impossible control. For black, queer kids and outcasts everywhere, Willie wasn't just a performer. He was proof that grace and power could exist in the same body, even when the world refused to see either. But visibility comes with a cost. After the documentary, Willie's sexuality and ballroom life were no longer whispered truths. They were on tape, catalogued, replayed. He didn't flinch from it. He claimed it. The culture, however, was not as fearless. Some outside the ballroom scene saw his openness as an offense instead of a revolution. And when, in 2005, word spread that Willie was living with HIV/AIDS, the stigma that had been circling suddenly tightened around him. Fashion houses that once loved borrowing his style and his models began to quietly drift away. A few designers, it was said, dropped him from projects, unsure how his diagnosis would play with conservative clients. Even inside spaces that were supposed to be safe, bias around HIV quietly reared its head. Contracts dried up. Teaching gigs replaced runway work. To cover medical bills, Willie sold his Harlem apartment. He kept going anyway. Weaker, thinner, but still drilling students in mirrors, still shaping new generations, while his own health slipped away. In 2006, Willie Ninja died in a public hospital far from the camera lights he had once commanded. The moves he created survived. They traveled to pop videos, award shows, global stages. Audiences screamed for voguing long after the man who perfected it was gone. But for years his name was left out of the credits. 13. Alvin Ailey, the dance giant brought down alone. Alvin Ailey didn't just choreograph dances. He choreographed survival. With the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, he carved out a space where black bodies on stage were not just allowed but celebrated. Works like Revelations stitched together spiritual struggle and joy into something that audiences felt in their bones. He built a company that became a lifeline for generations of black dancers who had been told there was no place for them at the center of the stage. But the man behind the legacy was carrying a secret that the Times refused to treat with compassion. In the late 1980s, Alvin Ailey was diagnosed with AIDS. In an era when fear and moral panic ran faster than facts, his illness wasn't treated as a medical condition. It was framed as consequence. Whispers about his sexuality and health circulated in arts circles, sometimes louder than conversations about his work. Funding, already hard-won for a black-led company, grew unstable. Some sponsors pulled back. Others hesitated. The company he had built from nothing teetered, forced to fight, not only for artistic survival, but financial survival. Meanwhile, Alvin's own body was losing the same fight. He kept working, kept pushing, kept traveling, even as disease weakened him. He died in 1989, reportedly in a public hospital, rather than the private care a man of his impact should have had. The company lived on. It grew. It toured the world. But for a long time the story of its founder's final years was told in a whisper, stripped of the full truth about what it meant to be black, gay, brilliant and punished, for all three at once. 12. Jermaine Stewart, the pop star, erased before the final chorus. For a brief window in the mid-1980s, Jermaine Stewart's voice was everywhere. "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off" wasn't just a song. It was a statement, joyous, playful, and strangely earnest in a music landscape obsessed with excess. Jermaine danced across TV stages in sharp suits and bright smiles, the kind of presence that made a room feel lighter. Then, as the decade turned, the tone around him shifted. In the mid-1990s, news broke that Jermaine was living with HIV/AIDS. Almost instantly, his sexuality became a headline. Not in a gentle, understanding way, but as ammunition. Radio programmers, especially on pop-heavy and mainstream stations, began quietly removing his songs from rotation. Labels that once centered him in their marketing pushed him to the margins, afraid of backlash in a culture that treated AIDS as a character flaw instead of an illness. Arista Records eventually canceled his contract. Concert offers evaporated. From chart-topping stages, Jermaine found himself singing in small bars and clubs, working show to show, trying to keep both his music and his dignity alive. Money grew thin. Medical costs grew heavy. Pieces of his old life were sold off just to stay afloat. Families strained by stigma and fear began to pull away. The man who had once made the world dance now faced his fight largely alone. In 1997, Jermaine Stewart died in poverty. Even his burial became a struggle, with reports that relatives initially refused to cover his funeral or headstone. For years his name drifted in and out of nostalgic playlists, the story of how he left this world rarely mentioned alongside the hook everyone still remembered. 11. Keith Barrow, a disco promise, cut off in silence. Keith Barrow had the kind of voice that seemed built for the era he was born into, big, soulful, perfectly suited for the drama and joy of disco. With songs like Turn Me Loose, he stood on the edge of a breakthrough, his performances full of energy, charm, and a sense that there was so much more to come. Then his personal life became a target. In the early 1980s, whispers about Keith's relationships in New York's gay community turned into open talk. Not long after, he was diagnosed with AIDS. Within a scene already under attack, and a culture that linked disco sexuality and sin, in the same breath Keith went from rising star to risk. Columbia Records decided he was a liability. Contracts vanished. Tours stopped. He moved from big stages to small clubs rooms, with dim lights and low pay, where his voice still soared, but the world had stopped listening. As his illness progressed, money disappeared. He sold what he had to pay for treatment. Nights grew longer. His Harlem rental became less a home and more a holding place between hospital visits. Family members, pressed by shame and outside judgment, distanced themselves. In 1983, at just 29 years old, Keith Barrow died in a public hospital. The disco era moved on. New stars emerged. His name became a passing reference. if it was mentioned at all, another file marked too early without ever fully acknowledging why. 10. Essex Hemphill, the poet left without a final audience. Essex Hemphill wrote for the people the world refused to see. His poems and films traced the lives of black gay men with an honesty that cut past stereotypes and respectability politics. Works like Brother to Brother gave language to experiences that had long been suppressed or distorted. His art was loved in specific circles and hated in others. When Essex was diagnosed with AIDS in the early 1990s, the stigma he had already been pushing against grew sharper. Conservative black voices labeled his work anti-cultural, accusing him of airing what they believed should remain hidden, framing his art as dangerous instead of necessary. Publishers stopped returning his calls. Film funders pulled out. PBs, which had once been an outlet, backed away. The gatekeepers didn't have to ban him outright. They just had to stop providing platforms. Essex found himself in a cramped Washington, D.C. apartment carrying both illness and the weight of being cast out by the communities he had tried to represent. Money was scarce. Treatment options were limited. Even some family members and cultural peers kept their distance, unwilling to stand next to the label that had been pinned on him. In 1995, Essex Hemphill died in a public hospital. No major obituary captured the full size of his impact. His words lived on in photocopies, in community gatherings, in classrooms, far from the rooms where his name should have been honored. He had written the truth about erasure. Then he was erased in the very way he had warned about. 9. Jean Anthony Ray, the dancer who fame forgot. When fame hit screens, Jean Anthony Ray was the spark you couldn't ignore. As Leroy Johnson, he moved like the rules didn't apply to him, raw, electric, and utterly magnetic. For many young black dancers watching, he was the first time they saw someone who looked and moved like them at the center of the frame. Then that frame narrowed. In 1999, reports of Jean's HIV/AIDS diagnosis surfaced alongside stories about his sexuality and struggles. Where the public once saw a fearless performer, the industry started seeing a problem. Calls from casting directors slowed, then stopped. The same Hollywood that had ridden his image into global recognition now acted as if he didn't exist. With no steady roles and no safety net, he slid from prime-time screens into survival mode, small club performances, low-paying gigs, anything to keep moving. Addiction crept in, not as a glamorous vice, but as a way to dull the ache of being used and then discarded. His finances collapsed. Housing became unstable. People who had once wrapped their arms around him on set began to keep their distance, afraid of stigma and their own reputations. In 2003, Jean Anthony Ray died in a public hospital, far from the bright lights he once commanded. For years, when people mentioned fame, they remembered the character. The man behind him and the way he left this world stayed mostly in the dark. 8. Little Richard, the architect of rock, exiled for being himself. Before most people knew what rock and roll even was, Little Richard had already set it on fire. Tutti Frutti, Long Toll, Sally, Good Golly, Miss Molly. His voice, his piano, his screams, his glitter, his hair, all of it blasted through a segregated America that wasn't ready for that much blackness or that much queerness in one body. On stage, he was untouchable. Off stage, the world tried to pull him apart. His flamboyant style and coded lyrics sparked questions about his sexuality almost from the beginning. And when he admitted in interviews that he was attracted to both men and women, the backlash came hard. Some church leaders called him a demon. Some critics called him a threat to morality. Record labels, radio stations, and promoters started to see him as dangerous, not because of his music, but because of what his existence challenged. At different points under the crushing pressure of both racism and homophobia, Richard stepped away from rock, entirely throwing himself into religion, then trying to return to music only to find that the industry was eager to borrow his sound, but not honor his truth. Deals dried up. Tours shrank. The man who helped invent the sound of an era spent long stretches of his life struggling with finances, identity, and the feeling that he had been asked to disappear from the empire he helped build. In his later years he lived much more quietly than the world he once created for others, the full complexity of his sexuality and suffering often smoothed over in public tributes. Little Richard didn't just lose opportunities. He lost the right to be fully himself in the spotlight he had earned. These lives do not connect by coincidence. They form a pattern, a map of how black gay artists could climb shine, and then be quietly pushed off the stage, left to face illness, poverty, and isolation without the support they had once been promised. And we're not done. 7. Ron Simmons, the manager who stood up for others and died with no one standing beside him. On the business side of the stage, Ron Simmons was the one artist called when they needed things fixed. A sharp manager, a strategist, and later an HIV activist, he built his career coordinating tours, negotiating deals, and quietly holding together the careers of major names who lived under the spotlight while he stayed in the shadows. Then one decision changed everything. In 1995, at a conference meant to educate and protect, Ron chose to do the one thing most people in his position were too afraid to risk. He publicly disclosed that he was living with HIV. He thought honesty might save lives. Instead, it cost him his own stability. Artists he'd supported for years began to slip away. Some stopped returning calls. Others, it was said, told him they couldn't afford the association. The HIV stigma in the black community and in the entertainment world didn't just make him a risk, it made him a target. European partners cancelled contracts. Bookings dried up. The man who used to mastermind other people's success suddenly had no clients left to manage. Back in the U.S., things grew even colder. In conservative spaces, his sexuality and HIV status were treated as proof that he had crossed a line. The community he had fought for now felt distant. Ron's life contracted into a small apartment in Brooklyn, where he lived on bits of assistance, trying to keep his activism alive even as his body and finances wore down. By the end, he had almost no support, no steady income, no safety net, and very few people physically present. The man who had once used his position to advocate for others died largely on the margins of the same culture he tried to protect. 6. Paul Winfield, the leading man Hollywood left to fade. Paul Winfield had the kind of presence that made a room go quiet. From Sounder to the Terminator, he brought a grounded intensity to every role, the kind of performance that made critics reach for words like commanding and iconic. An Oscar nomination confirmed what audiences already knew: Paul Winfield was built for the front of the frame. But Hollywood loves its myths, especially about what a black leading man is allowed to be. In 2000, tabloids began reporting that Paul was living with AIDS. Rumors about his sexuality, long kept at a distance, surged to the front of the narrative. Overnight, the industry that had once embraced him began to step back. Casting directors hesitated. Producers worried aloud about image and marketability. For a black actor, carrying both the label of gay and the weight of an AIDS diagnosis was treated as too much for Hollywood's narrow idea of masculinity. Scripts stopped coming. Meetings dried up. With work disappearing, Paul's resources thinned out. Behind closed doors, he sold what he could to keep up with treatment and living expenses. Old colleagues who had laughed with him on set grew scarce. He spent his last years quietly, far from the big roles and bright lights that had once defined his name. When he died in 2004, in a hospital room, it was not with the fanfare a trailblazer deserves, but with a kind of quiet that felt out of proportion to the impact he'd had on screen. The industry kept his performances. It rarely talked about the cost he paid for existing outside its comfort zone. 5. Billy Preston, the keyboard genius the industry stepped away from. Billy Preston's fingerprints are all over music history. He played keys for the Beatles, toured with the Rolling Stones, and carved out his own legacy with hits that carried his signature groove. When he sat at an organ, entire arenas followed his hands. But genius doesn't protect you from stigma. In the early 1990s, Billy's private life stopped being private. An arrest at a gay bar in Los Angeles turned the spotlight from his music to his sexuality. Soon after, he was diagnosed with AIDS. The backlash was swift. Bands he'd worked with for years quietly cut ties, afraid of the headlines that might follow. Promoters stopped booking him. Radio stations gradually eased his songs off the air. The man who used to fill stadiums now had to fight to get any stage at all. Without touring or major studio work, Billy's income collapsed. He sold his home, then moved into smaller and smaller spaces. Medical bills rose. Addiction crept in at the edges as a way to blunt the isolation and shame. The church that had shaped his earliest music and parts of his family circle struggled to accept his truth. Some turned away entirely. By the time Billy Preston died in 2006, it was in a hospital bed, still battling debts and the shadow of the labels that had been pinned to him. The same industry that had once relied on his sound let him disappear in near silence. 4. Storm de la Verre, the drag king who went from headliner to bouncer. Storm de la Verre was the kind of performer people didn't forget. On stage in the 1950s, with the Jewel Box Revue, she blurred the line between masculine and feminine with a swagger that made audiences question everything they thought they knew. As a drag king, she stepped into suits and stages that weren't built for someone like her and owned them. But the more visible she became, the more law enforcement and moral crusaders targeted the spaces she lived in. After being publicly outed as a lesbian following a raid at a famous New York bar, Storm's life shifted. Clubs that had once paid her to headline now started to worry about police scrutiny and morality laws. Anti-drag crackdowns made it harder and harder for her to legally exist as herself on stage. Owners called her too risky. Work dried up. Bit by bit, the spotlight that had once followed her narrowed to the doorways she guarded as a bouncer. Instead of stepping into center stage, she stood at the edge, protecting queer spaces from the same kind of harassment that had cost her her own career. The nights grew longer. The money grew thinner. Storm spent years moving through bars and small venues, a legend to those who knew, invisible to those who didn't. By the time she died in 2014, much of the world was only just beginning to acknowledge how much she had done, not just for entertainment, but for queer resistance itself. The system had pushed her to the margins, and she spent her last decades guarding the margins so others could step inside. 3. Francois Clemens, the friendly officer who had to hide in plain sight. To millions of children, Francois Clemens was Officer Clemens, the gentle policeman who shared songs and kindness on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He broke ground as one of the first recurring black characters on a mainstream children's show, and his presence told countless kids that someone who looked like them belonged in that safe, brightly lit world. Behind the scenes, his reality was far more complicated. In 1969, after an arrest at a Pittsburgh gay bar, rumors about Francois's sexuality began to ripple through the show's crew and the wider community. Fred Rogers, who cared deeply about the show's image and its young audience, is said to have asked Francois to keep his sexuality invisible to protect the program. It was framed as practical. For Francois, it felt like erasure. The fallout moved slowly but surely. Casting directors beyond the show hesitated to offer him major roles. Opera companies that might have showcased his voice grew wary, worried how a gay black man's presence would play with conservative donors and audiences. He kept his role on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for years in a limited capacity, and later turned more heavily to teaching and church music to survive. He was not expelled from the industry in a single dramatic moment. He was gradually pushed into smaller, safer spaces, where most of his gifts were kept out of public view. For a long time, Francois lived with the knowledge that he had helped build something gentle and good for children, while he himself was never allowed to be fully seen inside it. 2. Billy Strayhorn, the genius in the shadows of another man's name. Every time a big band slides into Take the A-Train, they're walking on Billy Strayhorn's tracks. As Duke Ellington's closest collaborator, Strayhorn wrote and arranged some of the most enduring pieces in jazz history. His fingerprints are all over the catalog, from melodies to harmonies, to the quiet structural choices that made those tunes timeless. But the marquee almost never carried his name. In mid-20th century jazz, especially among black musicians, public masculinity was policed just as tightly as race. Strayhorn's open life with a male partner in New York didn't fit the image that club owners, promoters, and even some peers wanted to present. Whispers about his sexuality followed him not as curiosity, but as a reason to keep him off the front of the stage. Producers and labels steered him away from a solo career. He remained tied to Ellington's orbit, not as an equal headliner, but as the quiet engine behind the throne. The tension between his talent and his lack of visibility wore on him. He drank heavily. Work and pressure piled up even as recognition lagged far behind. In 1967, Billy Strayhorn died, his name far less known than the music he had given the world. Only later did archives, interviews,